I was listening to your TED talk, and you were talking about the ability of reasoning to kind of do a good job of bringing a group to a consensus about what the truth is. On the other hand, you were talking in this particular instance about a particular kind of argument, and it's really an interesting one. So let's kind of lay it out. As I recall it, the little kind of puzzle was this. You said, okay, so like Ted is looking at Mary, Mary is looking at Bill. Ted is not married, Bill is married. Is someone who is not married looking at someone who is married? And, the intuition is to say we don't have enough information to say because we don't know whether married is not married. But then it turns out you look at it, and if either way, it is the case that, whether if you look at the case where Mary is married, and you look at the case, I shouldn't have chosen the name Mary, that's confusing. But if you look at the case where Mary is married, then she's being looked at by a non-married. If you look at the case where she's not married, and blah, blah, blah. So actually, we can say with complete confidence that someone not married is looking. And you showed that initially almost nobody gets this right, but then you put people together and they argue, and they all come to agree. They see the merits of the argument. Okay, that's fine, but the arguments that bedevil us are largely of a different kind, right? They're about who deserves what. Who gets to fly their flag? I saw a piece today about, the University of Vermont let a Black Lives Matter flag fly right next to the American flag. Predictably, this led to controversy. There's the question of the Confederate flag being flown in the sun and so on. Or there are much clearer cases where you're talking about competition over just finite resources, more obviously zero-sum games, and that's a certain amount of what politics is about right now. So I would think you would be less optimistic in
Yeah.
about those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, no, I mean it's not a magic bullet. So when you're talking about cases in which indeed there is it's an objective truth to it or an objective good answer, then our prediction, which is kind of largely borne out, is that indeed the group will converge towards the good answer if at least the elements of the good answer are present in it initially. But then if you have very strong conflict of interests, argumentation is not going to solve this. Some of them are just intractable. People disagree. They have as you were saying, they just have different interests. Mm-hmm. And so at best what you can hope that argumentation might achieve is if someone finds a good non-zero sum game to play in that context, then that person may be able to persuade maybe the other ones to see the merit of their option. And I think that in small groups that works relatively well. So if you look at the work of people like Elinor Ostrom, who've studied how small groups manage commons together and to without things completely falling apart, I think it works. I mean, there is a large part of it is argumentation and negotiation and people, exchanging arguments about how we should punish people who are cheating. And in small groups, it works, I think, relatively well. How does that translate into large nation states? It's much less clear and much more complicated because all the politicians have multiple interests, and one of the problems I would think is that even if in a way if everything was behind closed doors, maybe they might be able to agree to each other, but they have also a pressure to behave in a way that is expected of them by their constituency, and things get extremely complicated. So in a way, all predictions are off when it gets that complicated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and of course this helps explain why rhetorically people who are trying to bring consensus often emphasize the commonality of interest, the non-zero sum dynamic. Yeah. Don't we all want to make America strong? Don't we all want to do X, Y, and Z? And as a rhetorical matter, that can be effective, regardless, I guess, of how much of the actual contention it describes. So why don't you talk about some of the evidence that's consistent with the theory? I mean, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention lately, and these are elements of psychology that in some cases do complicate the business of us reaching consensus and coming together. Mm-hmm. One thing that's gotten a lot of attention over the last 10 years is confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. Talk a little about that.
So maybe a good way to set it up is to explain that, so in the psychology of reasoning, or in philosophy really in general, or in psychology in general, the dominant view of reasoning is what we can call kind of an individualist or an intellectualist view of reasoning, according to which the function of reasoning would be to figure things out on your own. You just, you reason really hard about something, or a decision you have to make, or a belief you have to hold, and then you just get better. You choose better products, or you choose better, political opinions. And if we wanted reasoning to work that way, ideally, we'd like it to be as objective and kind of exigent or kind of demanding as possible. So you would want to look for reasons, pros and cons, and you would want to make sure that the reasons you're examining are good reasons. And so indeed, what is sort of shocking with the confirmation bias, or the my-side bias, it's kind of been called both, is that it shows that reasoning doesn't work that way at all. So whenever you start thinking about something for which you have some kind of prior opinion, you will overwhelmingly find arguments for defending that prior opinion. And so indeed, it's been shown in many experiments, and kind of we all know that's how it works in a way. When you're reasoning on your own, then that usually leads to trouble. So people tend to become overconfident. They tend to polarize, to grow, to develop stronger attitudes. And so as much as I think that is a problem for this classical view of reasoning, I think it fits well with ours, because if the function of reasoning when it produces arguments is to convince someone else, then you want to have a confirmation bias. You want to find reasons that will support your beliefs and that will go against other people's opinions. That's for us, that's kind of usually the standard phrase. That's a phrase that's a feature, not a bug. Mm-hmm. But the thing that hasn't been maybe stressed enough in the way we've portrayed our theory, or other people have done so, is that this confirmation bias, when we produce arguments, has to be balanced by a much more objective stance when you evaluate other people's arguments. That is, if you are equally biased when you evaluate other people's arguments, then you would just reject all the arguments that challenge your point of view, which is kind of all the interesting arguments, really. And then you would just never change your mind, and argumentation would be largely pointless. So you have to. So I mean, our prediction regarding how we evaluate arguments when you hear someone else's give an argument that challenges your view is that you should be objective enough that if the argument is good, you recognize its strength, and you sort of change your mind accordingly. So that doesn't mean changing your mind completely, but at least changing your mind in the good direction.
Okay. Although there is, and I mean, again, I think here we have to distinguish between different kinds of arguments. Like if you're arguing that I shouldn't have something I want to have, in a certain sense, there's no such thing as a good argument for that case, from my point of view, right? I mean, I grant that to avoid completely embarrassing myself in argument, I have to concede obviously logical things. At the same time, I don't think you want to give the idea that in an argument like that, a kind of a moral argument, an argument about distribution of resources, that my mind really wants to acknowledge all the good points being made, right?
No, yeah. I mean, indeed, we wouldn't predict that, that Peter Singer is going to convince all of us to give all our money to poor Africans, or to stop eating all meat, and et cetera, et cetera. But you can still use moral arguments in a way that is effective. I mean, it's not. I don't think it would be true. It is true that moral arguments are as ineffective as they are sometimes portrayed. I mean, we know in our everyday lives, I think, that sometimes we talk to people about things we've done or things we plan on doing, and we can be swayed by thinking, no, I mean, you're a jerk if you do this for such and such reasons. And sometimes, because we do care about our moral reputation, then these arguments can indeed sway us. I mean, historically, an example I've looked at a bit is, and I think it's kind of, it's true of many other examples, the way slavery, or kind of the slave trade was abolished in England in the late 18th century and early 19th century. It was mostly through, it was largely through argumentation. People were saying, look, you can't be a good British Christian person and do this. It's just completely inconsistent to have these values and to engage in that practice.
Right. People were making those arguments, and I know you mentioned this in the paper I referred to, but I kind of wondered, how do you know that it was the arguments that were doing the work? I mean, there are these claims that actually, there are always claims that everything that happened for economic reasons, and I'm not conversant in the particular case made here, but I know there are people who say, look, actually, the economics of slavery were changing, blah, blah, blah. Another example of this is, well, first of all, reply to that. I mean, it's hard to say for sure that the arguments were carrying the day, right? I mean, there is the case that everything that happens on op-ed pages in newspapers is just like a shadow play, and the real underlying power dynamics are what are shaping policy, right?
Yeah, no, on the whole, I would agree, but I think the two are partly are not mutually contradictory. I mean, in the case of the abolition of the slave trade, it would seem as if, from my understanding, the economic argument would go against that because mostly England was standing to lose quite a bit of. Mostly, they would lose a lot of cotton that would coming from the U.S. and they were relying on that to give people work in their factories. So. I mean, at the time anyway, all the economic arguments that people were using were against abolishing the slave trade. So now it is still the case that if you're in the south of the U.S., the economic value of slavery is still so strong for a long time that people would not have heard. If you're a southern planter, very few of them would have been convinced by such arguments because so much of their livelihood relied on not accepting these arguments. But still, even when the economic conditions are ripe, that doesn't mean that communication in general and argumentation more specifically doesn't help the process go faster. And actually, there is some evidence now in political science. People who've done studies of just kind of door-to-door canvassing, so they go to people's homes and they talk about controversial issues, and it seems to have some kind of impact on people's attitudes. So it's hard to tell then again if it's really argumentation per se or more, other types of communication, empathizing with the person you're talking with and other phenomena. But it seems that it probably has some kind of impact. Like for instance, I mean, if you look at like the huge changes that we've had in most kind of Western societies over the past 40 years. And the economy hasn't, we've gotten wealthier, but it's not clear why now that we're wealthier we should be so much more accepting of minorities, of homosexuals, of women's rights, blah blah blah. I mean, and it has been these things have been heavily debated, not only in op-ed pages, but also which might be more productive in homes. People talk about that with their friends, with their family. I mean, I wouldn't say that these things are inefficient. I mean, I agree with you that there isn't very strong evidence that it is because it's just so hard to gather this type of evidence. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there is any strong evidence that it isn't either.